The Inspire Us podcast.
All right, well,
Okay.
welcome back. I was telling Dara this is good timing. We were just talking about the Elon Musk
Oh yeah.
beef with Trump, because even why they're kind of feuding is exactly what about the topic that you're kind of studying. Because Trump passed his big bill and Elon Musk wasn't happy.
Yeah, I mean they're both. I mean the crazy thing is that they're both right for the wrong reasons, because like what Trump has done. I mean Trump is he's a real estate thug and somebody who behaves as you do when you're making tough real estate deals. Wants as much money as possible, and this is giving large amounts of money to all his friends with the tax deductions for the extremely wealthy, and they'll be beholden to him afterwards. And that's a large part the sort of, mafia don style attitude that he's got. So he's willing to, if the deficit goes to $2.6 billion or trillion dollars, he's not the least bit concerned because there's extra money turning up the pockets of his wealthy friends, and they'll owe him, and that's all fine. Musk on the other, and so but what that means in terms of economics is that's a big stimulus for the economy. Okay, it's the opposite of what Musk was trying to do, which is to slash $2 trillion off the deficit.
But it seems like he's been having the same thing that Musk has been going on. He came in, he's like, all right, we're cutting waste, we're bringing in Doge. It seemed like he had that sort of mojo to him that he wanted to stop spending.
You mean Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, I guess it didn't last.
it's a salesman thing.
Yeah.
I mean, they all believe there's massive waste inside the government, and I saw one of the Doge staff, whether he's continued or not, or he's resigned, saying they just didn't find anything like the scale they thought they would find. And like when you work in the bureaucracy, you realise a lot of the waste comes out of excessive monitoring to make sure there's no waste or there's no corruption. It's like the university sector. I got sick of the way the bureaucracy works in the university sector, and you give 40% of any grant you get, 40% goes to the university. So they actually see grant getting as a revenue source for them. And then you've got this entire bureaucracy to make sure you do things properly. So they want to make sure you've got to hand in your receipts for everything. And ultimately there's so many constraints that it's the constraints that if any inefficiency applies, it's all the constraints that are there to stop the sort of thing that Doge thought they'd find. So if you want to make it more efficient, you stop preventing waste. Well, some of those things like is actually a good idea, because some of the monitoring is just crazy, particularly when it comes to the academic side of things. But in general, they didn't find what they thought they'd find.
And maybe you can break down for us, and it's good timing, as I said, you just recently wrote a book for Musk, macroeconomics for Musk and engineers. Can you break it down for us? What is it that Musk doesn't understand, and how is making the economy more efficient and cutting spending going to bite them in the ass?
Yeah, well, he doesn't understand. He understands conventional economics, and that's a big problem. He thinks he understands it because he swallows all the stuff out of Milton Friedman. There's an essential part of mainstream economics that argues the economy works best with zero government. You think about the classic supply and demand curve, which itself is garbage as a description of the real world, but that gives you so-called equilibrium when there's no government intervention. Okay? You only get the best possible outcome if there's no government. You get the best possible outcome in wage bargaining if there's no unions, and on it goes. Everything has to be market-based and nothing else, and that's the mentality that they've got. And it's a theory of the economy which leaves out the role of money creation. They leave money out completely of their macroeconomic thinking, and yet they give advice about what to do about the government deficit, which is a form of money creation. So you end up with crazy ideas that people think are well-grounded. And the one thing that I was attacking Musk on initially was to say, he said it's really important not to argue by analogy. But if you see all these arguments about cutting government spending, saying the government's just like a household can go bankrupt, therefore, that's arguing by analogy. So what I did in the book is say, let's argue from first principles. And the first principle of money is double entry bookkeeping. So you put double entry bookkeeping together and when you track through the way in which the government creates money, it completely eliminates the fear that Musk has got that the level of interest payments are going to wipe out the economy. And so that's my first principles approach. So you do the double entry bookkeeping. If you put in the model that the textbooks teach, that is about what banks are, they teach that banks are not money creators. They teach that banks are intermediaries between savers and borrowers. And what do you have? Households save, firms borrow from households and they can invest, and the government gets in there and also borrows and therefore reduces the amount of money the firm sector can give. And then the government, if it spends more than it gets back in taxation, it pays interest on that, on the bonds it issues to cover that gap. And then if you're borrowing that money off the households and taxing the households at the same time, you just get this exponential increase in the private debt ratio, exponential increase in interest payments. It's an absolute catastrophe. It's only one problem. That model's a fallacy. Loanable funds does not describe how banks work. Banks are not intermediaries. Banks are money and debt creators. So when a bank lends money to a firm, that creates money. When a bank lending doesn't create money for the government, but the bank balance sheet is involved in money creation by the government. So when the government runs a deficit, it's actually creating money. And
I just want to add, I saw a tweet you put out the other day of the Bank of England, linking the Bank of England, explaining how money is created, and they said banks, like I think 80% of the money created, or maybe all of it, is banks loaning money.
It's hard to work out exactly how much of the money supply is created by banks as opposed to created by the government, but they both are money creators. And the way in which they do it, again, it's just straight old double entry bookkeeping. If you borrow money from a bank, they put money in your deposit account, which is their liability, and they record that you owe them that amount of money in a debt account for you, which is their asset. So they boost liabilities and boost assets. That's how banks create money. Now, that's not taught by mainstream economics. They have two models of banking. One is what they call the money multiplier, and that explains money creation, sort of. Whereas the other one, the loanable funds, allegedly says that banks just redistribute existing money. Now, both models are false, because if you look at the money multiplier model, that says that if you walk into a bank and whack a $100 bill down on the teller's desk, the teller puts that in the safe and then gives you a receipt saying you've got $100 in your bank account. So they've created an asset for you as a swap for the asset you've given them. Then they hang on to that $10 of that 90 and lend the other 90 out. When you try to put that in double entry bookkeeping, it turns out the only way that model works is if the entire system works on cash. Okay? You deposit $100 in cash, the bank lends out $90 in cash, and then that person deposits 90 in cash, and the bank hangs on to 9 and lends out 81. Only if all loans are in cash does that model work to create money. Okay? Well, when was the last time you got a cash loan?
Yeah.
It's a fiction.
Actually, to correct myself, I don't think it was 80% of the money created. I think what I saw was 80% of the money that's in the economy is in deposits. So it's, and like there's some very small percent is cash.
Yeah, the cash is quite small, like actual physical cash. And this is where I think you often see a 97% claim made, and that says that 97% of the money is created by banks. What I think that means is 97% of the money supply is the sum of all deposit accounts at banks. Okay? Yeah. And then 3% is cash. But the government creates a lot of that money inside banks as well. And again, I find myself in this weird situation of trying to make double entry bookkeeping sexy, okay, which is crazy, but that's true. Because when you use it, it's like, my analogy for double entry bookkeeping is it's like a telescope for astronomers. Okay? Once you start using it, you see the structure of the financial system in a way you can't see if you don't use double entry bookkeeping. So when you do that, the reason it works is every transaction has a sender and a recipient, whatever that sender might be. There's one account goes, there'll be a debit for one account and a credit for the other, and that's the rule of double entry bookkeeping. So a credit and a debit on every line. And the hard thing for accounting is working out what do you classify as a credit and a debit. I've simplified that with Ravel. So it's just a plus if an account goes up and a minus if the account goes down, and we handle the mathematics of making sure the balance is there. So once you do it, you can only put 2 entries on each line. Now, if you, like the model that the mainstream uses, the money multiplier model, and that's still inside the heads of people like Bernanke. They literally believe that happens. So they haven't actually worked through the mechanics. But if you put it in the mechanics and you imagine somebody lending from reserves, you've got to put a minus in the reserves. And then lend from, you want to put it in a deposit account, you put a plus. Does not compute. It's a mistake. So the only way you can show them actually lending out money in double entry bookkeeping terms using the money multiplier model is there's a minus on reserves and there's a plus on deposits, a plus on loans, pardon me. But there's no element there of the borrower actually getting any money. So how can you show the borrower gets money? The only possibility is the loans in the form of cash, which the borrower takes from the bank and puts in their own piggy bank back at home. Okay? And then that means that all the transactions between banks have to be in cash as well. You think, that's not real. If it ever existed, it's 2 centuries ago. Yeah. So they teach models which, when you apply double entry bookkeeping to them, you should throw them in the garbage bin.
But have you seen that interview of Elon Musk when he was first going into the government and he was talking about this magic computer? It's like
magic money computers.
Yeah, there's magic money computer that's just sending out money. And at that point, you could say, oh, wait, maybe he's going to question that. Wait, the government is creating money just like that.
Well, he's halfway there. And that's one reason I hope they continue down that road and learn a bit more about the system, because when you go through and do the double entry bookkeeping, there is no account out of which governments are lending. Okay? You have a government, a decision is made to build some weapons system, a typical thing Americans do with their money creation system. That once the decision is made, then there's this computer that will say, okay, now this money's been approved. Who do we have as a supplier? We want them to build, let's say we're talking Boeing, the world's favorite company, Boeing for their rockets to the moon, and we put a credit amount in their bank account, okay, and it's just the computer itself says that. Now, when you look at in double entry bookkeeping terms, what happens at the Treasury is they simply say we're going to put that money in your bank account. And there's an entry there which is a negative for the Treasury's account of the central bank. Where's your matching entry on the overall system? It's a negative on the net financial assets of the Treasury. So the way the Treasury creates money is by reducing one of its assets and going into negative financial equity itself. That's the offsetting element. And it can do that because, hey, it owns the bloody country. So like the financial assets, which are what money is, and bank accounts and all that sort of stuff, they sum to zero. Okay, if you owe him money, okay, you've got an asset, he's got a liability. The sum of the two is zero. Okay, so the sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. Okay? Then when you look at the banking sector must be in positive financial equity, because if a bank is in negative financial equity, it's by definition bankrupt. So banks have to be in positive financial equity. So when you look at that, any perspective you take, if you find positive financial equity for one entity or sector of the economy, the rest of the economy is in negative financial equity to precisely the same magnitude. It's a conservation law. So if you have only banks, no government, the banks must be in positive financial equity. Therefore, the non-bank private sector is in negative financial equity. Okay? It's the only way, nobody enjoys having financial liabilities that exceed their financial assets. Makes us all nervous. Okay? But the only organisation which can cope with that indefinitely is the government, because it owns the bloody country. It's non-financial assets, the education systems, police, all the bureaucracy, the army, all this sort of jazz. Those are the non-financial assets that the government owns, and it's recognised as the authority in its land. It can cope with permanent negative financial equity, and that's how they create money.
But I think that's where people start asking questions when we start thinking about indefinitely and permanently. They think, can this go on forever? Can this go on forever?
It can, so long as the country doesn't get defeated in a war. I mean, you often get the Austrian mob and, gold bugs and Bitcoiners saying 100% of fiat currencies have collapsed. What they mean is 100% of countries have collapsed, not including current countries, okay? But that's all it means. A country, in some ways, is defined by where its money is taken seriously. So the extent to which you have a country is marked by your legal borders, but it's also marked by the border where your money is accepted. So the money is, as a liability of the state, is actually one of its powers. And when you realise that, then the government should be creating fiat money, and fiat money means by fiat, by law, I create money. Okay, it's just part of how a capitalist economy operates. There's governments create money by fiat, banks create money by increasing their assets and liabilities. And that's just part of how the system functions. So running a deficit is not a bug, it's a feature, because that deficit actually creates fiat-backed money. And then the rest of us use that money for commerce. So when you look at the healthiest period of American capitalism, and global as well for that matter, pretty much, was for the immediate post-war years, from about 45 to 75. That's what's known as the golden age of capitalism. At that stage, governments running deficits of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4% of GDP are not freaking out about it. Okay? And the government debt actually fell over that period as a percentage of GDP. But fundamentally, because there was so much money floating around, fiat money, you could finance businesses out of cash flow. You didn't have to borrow money as much to get into business, to start a new enterprise or design a new product. Once you got these idiots obsessing about eliminating government debt, then they're eliminating one of the sources of money. And in a capitalist economy, it's all about the money. If you don't have the money turning over, then people are going to either not do things, or they're going to borrow money from banks. And often what they'll do is they'll get involved in asset price bubbles. They'll speculate on the price of housing or the price of shares with borrowed money. And that gives you a runaway bubble, which is great until it crashes. So it's just basically, I'm trying to tell people who are trying to affect government policy, chill about the existence of a deficit. A deficit is an essential step in creating fiat money. It's a feature.
Yeah, because I actually have a mate who's a Bitcoin analyst. And a Bitcoin analyst.
Bitcoin analyst, okay.
So he's very pro-Bitcoin.
Yep.
And as you can imagine, he's also very anti-fiat currencies.
Yeah.
And he's always saying how malign the fiat system is and how it's created to rob us of our wealth. And I try to convince him otherwise, but he's so fixated on this point of view. He can't see any of the benefits of this fiat system that we've had. And it's sort of hard to reason with him.
Because the starting point that I want to talk with Bitcoin people is that they're obsessing over the money as a store of value. Okay, and they think money should not degrade. They think money should actually appreciate. That is actually a experience of deflation. Your money's getting more valuable over time. Okay, if you have, like, there's a classic story of some character who bought a pizza with something like 100 Bitcoin, or certainly more than 10. You know, if he hadn't spent those Bitcoin on a pizza, 10 years later he could have bought the pizza company. Okay? So it's an encouragement not to spend, and that's why when I first saw the HODL expression, what the for God's sake, hold on for dear life. Okay, now what that means is you accumulate Bitcoin, but you don't spend it. That goes against the whole role of money.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, and I think in that same way, I think that highlights that a lot of crypto is inherently different from fiat.
Oh yeah,
like people use it as an investment to make, like, as if it's real estate.
Yeah,
to make money later.
I'm sorry I didn't buy any. I could have bought it. You know, I first had Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, who were friends of mine at the time, hammering me about you should buy some Bitcoin, and I didn't do it because I looked at the way that they verify transactions, which involves the necessarily wasting 10 minutes of computing power before you generate the non-string, as they call it, I think. That validates entry on the blockchain, and that's using the energy cost as a deterrent for people forging the blockchain. Even though the blockchain being public, you've got to make it difficult for anybody to replicate it and they put a fraudulent transaction in there. And I thought, 10 minutes of bloody computing power? I'm not going to wait 10 minutes to have my coffee at a coffee shop. And they've worked out things like the lightning system around it and so on. But fundamentally, it wastes an enormous amount of energy, and it also involves long time delays, which mean that you actually got to override that side of Bitcoin to enable Bitcoin to function as a form of money. Now, all that stuff made me think, oh, not worth getting into. But I could have afforded to lose £1,000. I could have bought 1,000 Bitcoin. I'd be a bloody billionaire now. So I kick myself over not getting involved in that particular speculative bubble. But it's still a speculative bubble. But if people use their Bitcoin for transactions, they're potentially giving up like gains of increasing their money, the value of their money, by a factor of 2 or 3 over a year. So the thought, you can handle it if you had a speculative asset which is rising in price, you could handle selling a small bit of it to turn that speculative gain into actual physical goods and services or fiat money. But when it's growing that fast, people just don't spend. Now, how the hell is something which people don't spend with going to replace money?
Well, isn't the idea is that it's like the digital gold, and it can it has the same properties as gold, but you don't need to be encumbered by the cost of transporting gold. You can send it digitally, and this sort of has great benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it's very useful for evading. If you want to go through a thing where you don't want the legal authorities tracking you, I mean, it's not fully anonymous, but it's semi-anonymous. So I think it's mainly used for transactions which were illegal in the first place. People are sacrificing a huge amount of spending power to buy anything with it at the moment. So, and also there's those 21 million Bitcoin, and they're infinitely divisible, not infinitely, but divisible to a crazy scale. And that means, like, as a speculative object, it's like being able to trade a 10th or 100th for the Tulip, which means the speculative side can continue rising because the barriers to entry in buying into tulips, we're talking in Amsterdam, which is the centre of the world's first major speculative bubble, tulips back in what it was, the 1600s. And you had crazy prices being paid for tulips at the absolute peak of the bubble. Like a tulip cost a house, that sort of level. The classic transaction I remember is that to buy one particular tulip, the buyer paid 2 houses and a horse and a carriage. Yeah, and then it all collapsed to nothing. Okay, the thing is, you couldn't buy a fraction of a tulip. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. So in that sense, the capacity to continue sucking people in.
We're talking about Tulip the flower.
Yeah, did you know that? Oh, well, you are a European version, aren't you? No, you haven't heard the tulip story before.
No.
Well, you better go check out some tulips while you're here in that case. The tulips were they're Turkish flower, I think, and then hence the shape of them and the name. And they became like a fancy element in houses. I think it's about the 1600s. I could have the century wrong. And people started buying and selling and trading tulips. And then there was this runaway price acceleration with people believing they've bought a tulip now to be worth more tomorrow and, buy more tulips. And they didn't even know how the colours and the shapes were formed. So one of the famous, most important something emperor or some name like that was actually due to a virus. And like you could buy the bulbs and not have the virus passed on, pay a fortune for the damn thing, and it became an ordinary tulip. All this sort of stuff turned up. But it was a crazy, crazy bubble.
So you essentially bought a tulip to decorate your house, but you had to sell your house to buy the tulip.
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
And like, in that case, we're always attracted to an asset which is rising in value, okay? So in that sense, Bitcoin, the way it's created, was probably done to the gold argument is you've got some sort of real value behind the item. Money's got no asset backing it. Here's an asset backing it. All that sort of shows. But the real attraction is the increase in the price. Now, the increase in the price means you'd be a fool to use it.
Yeah.
Huh?
But perhaps, so why does gold have value? Perhaps it was time.
Well, gold. People think gold was money. Okay, you obviously think that. Okay? You look at the historical record, and this is where David Graeber. Do you know David Graeber at all?
No.
Okay, David.
Graeber
Unfortunately,
Institute. Is that?
yeah, that's carrying on. As David died, we can't prove it because it was before tests existed, but he died of COVID. He had a pancreatic failure. He was younger than me. He's about 10 years younger than me, and just died in August 2020 out of the blue. But he was an anthropologist who specialised in looking at the growth of did a whole range of things, but looking at growth of human societies over time and money, how had money evolved.
Did you know him?
Yeah, he's a good friend. It was the biggest shock to me in many ways was his death that year.
Wow.
Because my mother died, but she was 94. COVID was a pain, but it was a pain for everybody. David dying was a real shock for me. But anyway, a lot of what he did was he popularised work done by other friends of mine, so like Michael Hudson, for example, and Cornelia Wunsch are two people that again, good friends of mine who did research into the origins of money. And when you take a look at the origins of money, money was never a commodity. It was never a barter. This myth of barter is something that comes out of Adam Smith and classical economists. It's not the real world at all. But when you look at when was gold money, okay, what you find is physical gold, not like gold coins, but physical gold, was only ever effectively used as money during periods of social breakdown. So you'd know about the 100 Years' War?
France, England.
Yeah. You know about the 100
Yeah, so that's my territory. So
okay. The 100 Years' War was ultimately mercenaries were everywhere. And the mercenaries insisted on being paid in gold or silver because there was no guarantee your side was going to win. If you back the king and the king gets killed, what the king paid you to fight is now worthless. The coins.
Because it was the king's coin, right?
The king's coin, yeah. So in that case, you would not accept payment in something which was based on the legal system of the country you were fighting for. Okay? So when you had a breakdown of social order, wars between different regions, countries likely to collapse, kingdoms obviously collapsing, yes, then people use gold and silver. Okay? But when periods of prosperity, when there was political stability for some substantial time, the money was fiat and credit. And like have you heard of tally sticks?
No.
Okay. Go to the Bank of England museum back in London and check it out. Tally sticks were pieces of wood which were marked in particular ways as a record of some financial transaction. So I'm lending you 100 sheep and I want 110 sheep back in 2 years' time. That sort of arrangement.
Okay.
So they would mark the actual transaction using agreed strokes on a piece of wood. I've forgotten the type of wood, but it's a particular tree that was commonplace to be used at the time because its internal grain was unique. You couldn't forge it. So they'd make all the marks, then they'd cut it down the middle. That'd be what they call the stock, which had the stump of the thing, and I've forgotten the other component of it. But they would then separate the two, and only when you'd paid everything back, you'd then put the two together, agree that the transaction had been met, and then you'd destroy the piece of wood, potentially. But that was also used for taxation. So you could pay your taxes in London using tally sticks. Okay? There was a transferable liability. I've forgotten the stock and the check, that sort of thing. Okay, so people would pay their taxes that way. And that was before the invention of paper money. It was not before coins, but coins was either large transaction, you're talking gold coins, and they were gold, which the gold coins were valued at more than the value of the gold in the coin. Okay, otherwise people would melt the damn thing down. So the actual gold coin was worth more than the gold in the coin. And the gold was there just for effectively to make it hard to forge, just like the rims we see on coins, the vertical rims that made it hard to clip coins and so on. But fundamentally, transactions were driven by credit instruments where people would agree that I promise to repay you and here's the record of my promise. And when I fulfill the promise, then that instrument is either destroyed or passed on to somebody else and my debt is extinguished. That's what commerce was on. The idea that we were using gold or silver for all our exchanges in past history, or that we had barter and we were swapping microphones for iPhones. No, that's a myth. So when you look at the practical history of money, it evolved out of promises to pay, fundamentally a credit system. And so, thinking that gold should be money is something which it's a hang-up from 17th century beliefs about capitalism being a barter system, and it's never been a barter system.
Wow.
In the sense you mentioned that gold became prominent when, there was a war and the king's coin, people didn't believe in it. I think that remains true today. Looking at America, do you think the US dollar still has, potential in the future? Or is it losing
The US dollar
trust?
should never have been used for international trade. This is one of the huge mistakes.
Why?
Because you should not use a national currency for international trade. Because it distorts the entire system.
But then what would they use?
Didn't Keynes have an idea of how to structure the financial system, and that was rejected?
Well, the structure, the best work I've seen in terms of what is a monetary economy and how it should be structured is done by an Italian academic now deceased called Augusto Graziani. And he went through saying, what is a monetary economy? Like logically, how can you distinguish a monetary economy from a system using barter, which is the mainstream myth? He says, well, for a start, money can't be a commodity, because if it's a commodity, you're just saying one of those commodities is money. It's still a commodity system. It's still a barter system. So it can't be just based on promises, because if you say, like an IOU, if I say I want that microphone, I owe you $400, unless I fulfill on the $400, we've still got a debt obligation between the two of us. And Graziani said the money has to be a token in that case, not something which anybody can make, and it must have no value apart from being able to enable transactions. In that sense, it's not something which is you could use it for some other reason, like you could roll your joints using money. That's not the role. So money said, and money should not give the creator of money seigniorage. The fact you can create money and go shopping with it, that shouldn't be feasible. So he said the only way to fulfill that is to have money being fundamentally the promises to pay of a third agent that the two people involved in a transaction accept as a complete discharge of the relationship between them. So if you wanted to buy that mixing, you would make a transfer from your bank account to his bank account. Your account goes down, his goes up. He then says, yes, okay, my account's gone up sufficiently. Here's the mixing device. Okay, and in that case, rather than the model that the Neoclassical shove into our brains, that all exchanges involve two parties with two commodities, and they've got to work out a relative price. Real exchanges are two parties, yes, but one product, that thing, and a monetary exchange, where the monetary exchange is a transfer from the bank account of the buyer to the bank account of the seller. That's the actual structure of a proper money system. So if you look at that at the level of like an individual bank, if you guys both banked at the same bank, then you have a triangular system. There's the buyer, the seller, and the bank. Okay? And if you bank at different banks, then there's another triangle, and that's got to be the buyer's bank, the seller's bank, and the central bank. Then at the national level, it should be one nation, another nation, and an independent financial system, not some other bloody country's currency. Because when you do that, it means that the country that issues that currency, there's all sorts of effects behind it, but one is seigniorage. They can literally create money and buy stuff. And you'll see the modern monetary theory crowd, which is one area that I completely disagree with them on. They say, like, exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. Speaking from the point of view of the American economy, we give them pieces of paper, effectively, and they give us physical goods. It's easier to make physical. Being the monetary authority for the planet means we can easily create the dollars. That's, creating a dollar might cost a cent. Okay, creating a machine that costs $1,000 might be $500 worth of labor and machinery going into it. We come out ahead. We give them something worth a few cents. We get something worth a few $100s, and that's the attitude they've got. And that's saying we're exporting seigniorage because we are the international currency. We can create it and give people American dollars and get goods back almost for free. Now, that's abusing the structure of a monetary system. And what you see with that being done indefinitely over time, one thing it means is, of course, the country that has that power has enormous power, but it also undermines its own manufacturing system. Because if your currency is used for international trade, then there's a demand for your goods and a demand for your money that goes beyond the demand for your goods and services. So therefore, your currency is likely to be overvalued, which means your manufacturing sector can't compete, and over time your manufacturing sector will lose out. That happened to Britain. Now it's happening to America. So it's a silly thing to have an American dollar or the British pound beforehand as the basis of international trade. We should have a neutral thing where the same triangular structure applies. Yeah.
So do you think that neutral thing could be Bitcoin?
No, because Bitcoin, well, numerous reasons, but one is, again, I've said you don't want to use it. Okay, the attraction.
But if it's countries using it for international trade, all of a sudden they do want to use it. It'll become like now there's no use for it. But if it becomes in itself a commodity where countries are trading, then now people would just use it.
Possibly. You could have a Bitcoin standard. You'd need to stop it appreciating. Okay. You
need some stability.
Yeah, a monetary standard needs some sort of stability. You can't, go down to the shop and find you've got half the price of an egg sandwich, or twice the price of an egg sandwich. You want to have some stability. So you need to have a period where the price doesn't change all that much. The way Bitcoin is set up and then the attraction that people have, it's going to rise in price. Now, if people find, it's going down in value, I better sell it before it goes, you're going to get crazy booms and busts.
Especially if the international community announces, we're going to use Bitcoin for international currency, it's going to...
Well, see, the thing that Keynes proposed, a thing he called the Bancor, his idea for the post-Second World War international financial system was there'd be an international clearinghouse called the ICU, and it would use a unit of account that he called a Bancor, which actually it means it's French for bank gold. You should understand that. So he wanted that currency to be used, and it wasn't a currency; it was a unit of account. So what it meant was, if you were running a trade deficit, then you would have a negative balance at the ICU. Running a trade surplus, you run a positive balance, and the sum of all positive and negative balances would be zero, because the sum of all international balance of payments levels is also zero. Somebody's export, somebody else's import. So the sum is zero. So it was a way of saying we could use a unit of account. It didn't have to be a currency. And in fact, you couldn't create it. That was one of the essential ideas of the Bancor. The sum of all Bancor was zero. Okay? And they only exist if there are imbalances between different countries. And Keynes wanted to limit the scale of balance of payments, surpluses and deficits. So he wanted to pretty much ensure that overall each country had close to balanced trade, because the sum of all trade deficits is zero. You don't want to have large deficits because they cause large surpluses, and vice versa. So he had interest payment charges on anybody running a large surplus or a large deficit. And those interest payments then went to third world countries as a way of enabling them to buy goods off other countries to develop their economies. So it was a much more sensible system than what we've got. I can't see Bitcoin fulfilling the same role.
So essentially, the US dollar becoming an international trading currency was good for the US short term. It gave them a lot of benefits, and they used that power. But long term, it's not good. It's affecting their manufacturing and really their economy. But do you think Trump, now that he is bringing focus on American manufacturing, will essentially make moves to remove the US dollar?
This is where his ego gets in the way. Like I thought the only way to get him to consider a saner system without the United States dollar at the center would be to call whatever the unit of current was the Trump. I call it the Bancor, something that preserves his name indefinitely. So yeah, call it the Trump, and that's you know what you need to do for every country. You'd need to have an exchange rate between the local currency and the Trump, okay, and it'd be a floating exchange rate. Keynes's idea was a fixed exchange rate, which you could be forced to reorganise. You can make it a floating exchange rate these days. It's not a huge amount of difference, but with the Bancor itself, and let's call it the Trump, he was discouraging large negative and large positive balances, and that's exactly what Trump is complaining about, saying countries have been raped and pillaged, yada yada yada, and that's an inevitable side effect of being the currency for international trade, because people will want your dollar for the sake of all transactions, not just buying goods off you. So it gets overvalued, so your manufacturing sector becomes less competitive. But at the same time, American corporations deliberately took production offshore because they were seduced by low wages in third world countries as a way of increasing their profitability. So rather than America being raped and pillaged, it went abroad and raped and pillaged, but to the benefit of the countries it was in, it drove up wages and enabled investment to take place there. The people who suffered were the working class people who used to work in American industrial conglomerates, and they now find they've got no job, and they end up being unemployed or working in some security type job. Henny penny security man type stuff, and they're the ones who vote for Trump. So yeah, he potentially could bring it in. I don't think he will, because I think he just enjoys the power thing of the U.S. dollar. So,
but I think I don't see why the U.S. would want to. Like, they'll go to war. They'll go to World War III before they give up the U.S. dollar.
I think that's true. So I can't see them ever giving it up. But like countries outside the United States now saying, "What is this madness?"
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to ask, because it seems like countries are starting to say that, and Trump responded to that saying, "Yeah, don't ask questions. There will be consequences to your questions."
Thug behavior again. He just enjoys using power. So I think that other countries are going to basically, well, screw that, because the BRICS were for a long time were trying to get an alternative trading system.
Yeah.
You need something the Americans can't manipulate, because for example, the SWIFT system, which is the telecommunications system for transferring money internationally, uses the American dollar as the unit of account. I think all the money passes through the New York Fed, and they banned Iran from that system some years back. So they've turned the American dollar into a weapon.
I mean, even for, I think, the Ukraine-Russia war, I think it was also used as a weapon against Russia. I'm not too sure, but...
No, banning accounts and trying to take ownership of their gold in different countries and stuff like that.
But I think that was a mistake on their end to use it as, military, or use it for their political ends, because that's what is waking up countries to say, hey, what
we need a better system.
We need a neutral system.
So in that case, America would hate to do it, but I mean, if we survive the next 4 years of Trump, then I think it may be quite possible that countries other than America decide we need a system which is not dominated by the American dollar, and there's a possibility that the Bancor could be created.
Go ahead.
So do you truly think we can have a more balanced international financial system?
Oh, we could have had it. Like if you have you heard of a guy called Harry Dexter White?
Wasn't he the bloke part of the IMF, Bretton Woods sort of thing?
He was an American negotiator at Bretton Woods, and he was basically opposed to Keynes and knocked Keynes's plan out and insisted on the American dollar and convertibility into gold. Now, convertibility into gold lasted just over 25 years, that fell apart. And then the theory was that we've got floating exchange rates now, so they'll get rid of all the trade imbalances. Well, that's 50 years of that. That hasn't worked, And America's now running about a 4% of GDP trade deficit every year, 4 to 6% of GDP. When you do the double entry bookkeeping on that, and I'm having a fight with MMT people over this at the moment, that transfers money creation from America to the countries that are running trade surpluses. And so what you've got, the large part of the deindustrialization of America, you can also slot home to the fact that a large part of the money that's being created in America initially, ends up creating money elsewhere because of the trade imbalance. So there's, it's great for the financial sector. That's where the vampire squids have come from and the dominance of American financial institutions globally. But it's bad for the American, the heart of America used to be manufacturing.
But could you say perhaps it's given developing countries a clear roadmap as to how to develop? It's just to generate this current account surplus.
Yeah, well, this is where I'm having a fight with MMT at the moment because, like MMT, I completely agree with their analysis of government money creation. Double entry bookkeeping, I can prove that they're right. Not just I like what they argue, you can prove that they're correct about how the government creates money. But at the same time as coming up with that brilliant insight that Warren Mosler had, that the government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax. Okay? That's a brilliant and correct inversion. You can work out the mathematical logic of it using accounting, completely correct. Okay? But he also came up with exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And he put that forward because he was running, he wrote a book called The Seven Deadly Fallacies. Okay? And one of them was the trade deficit's a bad thing. He wrote it because he's running for American president. And a lot of people would say to him, oh, we've got this terrible trade deficit. He said, oh, no, we gain out of the trade deficit. So as well as, the exports are, as well as saying the government effectively creates money to spend, it doesn't have to borrow. That's incredibly important, very useful insight that deserves to be respected and rewarded without a doubt. But this thing, exports are a cost and imports are a benefit, is the same nonsense that neoclassicals come up with, and they think the allocation of existing resources tells you what you should do to invest over time. And it's a complete fallacy. It's have you heard of what's called ergodicity?
Say that again.
A word called ergodicity.
Never.
Okay,
Never.
One guy I've got to interview is Ole Peters from the London Mathematical Society. So Ole...
What's his name?
Ole Peters.
Ole Peters.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
And he's just released a book called An Introduction to Ergodic Economics. What he's actually talking about is non-ergodic. What an ergodic process is something where what applies across space also applies through time. So if you imagine you were trying to work out whether you should take a particular investment, okay, then if you could use data about the probability across time at one point in time, it's fairly easy. Multiply the odds of something happening by what you get if those happen at a point in time. That's easy. If you wanted to track what's going to happen over time, you've got a very complicated dynamic process. You might not be able to work it out. So when something has the same average across space that it has through time, that makes it really easy to decide what to do. Unfortunately, the number of things for which that applies is virtually zero. Okay? But economists apply it all the bloody time. And what Mosler was doing by that exports are a cost, imports are a benefit, is saying because you gain out of each individual trade, if you're handing over money you can create and they're giving you goods back, you're exploiting seigniorage. Therefore, that's the best thing to do over time, continue running a trade deficit and you'll benefit from the trade deficit. But I can give a mathematical example of where that is a fallacy for something that conventional economics tells you is a good idea. So if you are offered a gamble where if you put $100 down and you toss a head, you get 150. Toss a tail, you get 60. Okay? Now, if you work that out, you got a 50% chance of 150 and a 50% chance of 60. The sum of the two is $105. So put down 100, 105 return, yeah, you should do it. You know what you get if you actually put $100 down and then play that game sequentially over time? You get 72 cents. The reason being that when you look at across space, if you were given that offer, that gamble, and you put $100, you put $1 down on each of 100 tables, okay, 50 of them are likely to give you heads, 50 are going to give you tails, you get 75 from that lot, you get 30 from the other lot, half of 60, if I made a mistake earlier, that's $105, you come out ahead. Okay? But if you put $100 down on one table and then you toss a coin and get a head, it gives you 150. Toss it again, you get a tail, you get 0.6 of 150, which is 90, you've lost $10. Each time you get a pair of heads and tails, you lose 10%. You do it for 50 throws, you end up with 72 cents. So what looks like makes sense across space is a stupid thing to try doing over time.
Wow.
The same thing applies with this idea about exports for a cost, imports for a benefit. What it means is we get immense benefit out of people working hard to make goods for us, and we just sit back and we're making the notes. Well, what it means is you stop investing. Okay, you don't invest domestically anymore. Why would you bother investing if firms in the other countries are making the investment goods to produce the consumer goods that you buy off them? You lose the skills. Why train people to run machine tools if you don't need machine tools? You just need your paper press, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an extremely bad idea on which to base a strategy for development of your economy through time. And this mistake is the neoclassicals make the same mistake because they talk about comparative advantage. You've done that stuff at uni?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, comparative advantage tells you how to get an efficient allocation of existing resources, allegedly. Okay? But it doesn't tell you how to develop those resources over time. But that's how people interpret it. So if you say the best thing to do is to specialise at your comparative advantage, what that means is you cease investing in everything else. You just do what you're good at that point in time. So on that basis, Japan should be the world's greatest exporter of silk.
Right.
It's just nonsense. That's not the. So what works through time is not what maximises your utility at a point in time, and that's a common error in neoclassical economics. And that's why I'm annoyed that modern monetary theory has recreated the same error in a different guise. And I'm finding myself arguing with a lot of modern monetary theory people about the sensible thing is to limit trade imbalances.
Okay. And what are their rebuttals? How do they argue?
Oh, they come back and just say exports for a cost, imports for a benefit.
So they come back with the same thing.
They came back with the same thing. Now, my rebuttal is, and this is the point, there's actually a wonderful new book by Jamie Galbraith and Jin Chen. There's the game. You know the name Galbraith?
Yes.
John Kenneth Galbraith.
I think I've referenced him.
Okay, that's his dad.
Oh,
all right.
okay.
So J.K. Galbraith is an absolutely brilliant oratorical writer, and Jamie, his son, is probably a better economist than his father was. Nobody can touch J.K. Galbraith when it comes to oratory, but in terms of logic, I think Jamie is probably stronger. And Jamie at one point said how it's a mistake to think that what maximises your utility at a point in time is a sensible development strategy over time. He said only economists and small children make that mistake. Okay? So like for my little analogy, the same sort of exports for a cost thing, lying in a beanbag, getting stoned and drinking fine wine while listening to music gives you more utility than going to a gym. Yeah. Therefore, I should lie in a beanbag and get stoned and listen to good music, and in 30 years' time, I'll look like a fucking beanbag. It doesn't give you a strategy. What maximises your utility at a point in time is not a strategy of development over time.
Wow. But that's one thing I think me and Dara were wondering once we encountered MMT, which is basically saying that the government should print and that's good for the economy. Is like, what is this? Once we accept that, what's the strategy now? Do we just start signing away, bills?
No, you look at what money is a means of motivating physical activity in that sense. So you want to, if you're looking at it kind of like if you want to have good health, good education, good transport, et cetera, you can fund that. And those are the sorts of things which the private sector won't necessarily provide. They'll provide health if it's profitable. Given the distribution of income, that means a substantial slab of the population can't afford health. Okay? And babies can't afford health. Retired adults can't afford health in that sense, unless they're children of the wealthy or they're wealthy old people. So you get a whole range of things which make society better, which are unlikely to be provided by the private sector because the return is too far in the distance. There's another good colleague of mine, Avner Offer, has written a book called The Public-Private Divide, and he makes the point that the public sector is better at doing things which have a long delayed payoff because when you look at the cost of the private sector of actually raising the money to build something which might have a payoff in 30 years' time, the odds are the interest rate costs are going to be so great, or the imputed dividend costs are going to be so great, they won't do it. But you have things like sewerage, for example. Sewerage works best if everybody has sewerage. Okay? If you have sewerage for the wealthy and no sewerage for the poor, the rich are still going to be walking past open latrines and potentially getting diseases. So there are a range of things where, given the need for absolute reliability of supply and guaranteed that it exists in the future and is maintained, you're better off having that stuff done by the public sector. So there's a range of things which it makes sense for the public sector to do, which will not compete with the private sector. And by doing it, you may actually inspire more private sector investment. So there's a reason. The whole conventional Western debate gives you these bloody extremes. The neoclassicals want everything to be private. The old-fashioned Marxists want everything to be public. It's a mixture. There's a mixture between the two. So you want the government to be creating money that can finance, education, health, welfare, transportation infrastructure, that sort of thing. You want the private sector coming up with new mobile phones, new cameras, that sort of thing, where the return is faster. So there's a symbiosis between the two, not a conflict.
Yeah, such a shame we can't have a more nuanced perspective.
I know, it drives me balmy.
It's extremely black and white. There's no middle ground. I was going to ask you, since you predicted the global financial crisis in 2008, what most worries you right now?
Global warming.
There's no others that compete.
Nothing else matters. I mean, we had our financial crisis in 2008, and nothing was done to address the causes of that. I'm actually writing a little piece on that right now because I'm commenting on Ted Cruz arguing that the Federal Reserve shouldn't pay interest on...
Ted Cruz?
Ted Cruz.
The actor?
No, the American...
Tom, Ted.
Oh, Tom Cruise. Okay. My bad.
That might increase the YouTube rating, you never know. So Ted Cruz discovered that the Federal Reserve is paying interest on reserve balances of financial institutions or banks. So they pay interest on bonds. He knew that. Now he's finding they're paying interest on reserves as well. Why are they doing that? Because they stuffed up with the global financial crisis. They thought it was actually good to have more private sector borrowing when that's what caused the bloody global financial crisis. So you've got this absolute craziness over interest payments in the States. So, and then government debt and so on. I've lost my train of thought, by the way. You better drag me back again.
He was asking about global warming.
Global warming. Okay. Anyway, so all this, pardon me, there was a big diversion. I got caught up in something else. We are in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Nothing's being done to solve its impact. What that means is that to have a serious crisis, you've got a serious increase in the level of private debt. Now, because we haven't reduced private debt much from where it was at the peak of the global financial crisis, there's not this potential for that huge increase in credit at the same time. So if you look at the American economy in 2006, the increase in private debt that year was equivalent to 15% of GDP. And that boosted aggregate demand and income. Something else I had to prove that my fellow post-Keynesians hadn't worked it out, but it's easy to show that credit is part of aggregate demand and income. So if you have people borrowing an amount of money equivalent to 15% of GDP in a year, they're boosting aggregate demand by 15%. Okay? Then when the crisis hit, people are going bankrupt, paying back their debts, everybody's having willing to go into debt to buy assets that are rising in value. When they started to plunge, people were trying to get out of debt. Okay, so it went from plus 15% in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009. Now that's in 20% of GDP turnaround in aggregate demand. Okay? What we should have done, and we did this by accident after the same thing happened back in the 1920s, huge increase in private debt, and then a financial collapse. And then over time, both the Great Depression and World War II meant that private debt level fell from about 140% of GDP in America down to 50%. Okay, so that meant that by the time the Second World War ended, you have credit-based demand without increasing the level of private debt too much for some substantial time. Then we got caught up in another bubble, just like the 1920s. The 1990s were like the 1920s in the sense that you had the Roaring 20s, the huge bubble there of telecommunications. Well, the bubble then was radio, okay, radio and telegraph and other communication systems. A large part of the money was going into those sorts of stocks, the beginning of TV and stuff like that. So people were borrowing money to gamble on rising prices of shares in these companies. And you had a real estate bubble back then as well. We repeated the same damn thing in the 90s and the early noughties up to 2007. Then it all came crashing down. Now, the 1920s thing eliminated the overhang of private debt. But the 2007 crisis, the overhang is still there because people like Bernanke and all the conventional economists they thought increasing private debt was a good idea. They had no fucking idea about how big it was. They had the data. They never looked at the data. They misinterpreted the data. I've seen published papers where they clearly mistake the rate of change of debt for the level of debt. It's a huge error. Yeah? So not understanding money, not understanding private debt, they try to encourage us back into it. And the spending they did, all the TARP program and the stimulus programs under Obama, they basically meant that private debt fell from about 170% of GDP to 150%, and it sort of stabilised that level. Well, that's such a high level of debt to begin with that most people are going to be wary about taking out debt for some project, and banks are sort of wary about lending too much. So you're not getting a large amount of credit-based demand. It's peaking at about 8%, maximum, say, 10% of GDP, but it'll then fall back down again. So you need a big swing around, and that means a big level of credit followed by a big fall. We're only getting a small level of credit, so I can't see a big fall coming out overall out of that. So I don't expect an internal crisis in the financial sector to hit the value of financial assets. But at the same time, again, economists are to blame. Idiots like William Nordhaus, who argued that climate change of 3 degrees by 2100 would only reduce the level of economic activity in 2100 by 3% compared to what it would have been in the absence of global warming. So 3 degrees is trivial. That's garbage. He has no idea of what he's talking about. And therefore, we've added so much heat to the global atmosphere and the global oceans as well. At some point, we're going to see catastrophic breakdown of our capacity to produce output. We're going to see storms that mean that parts of the world, like Florida, for example, you won't be able to get insurance anymore. The insurance system will fall over. And when we realise just how serious this threat is, then all the valuations we have for all the private companies are going to be, holy shit, that's wrong. How do I get my money out of there? We're likely to see a stock market crash from realising how serious global warming is rather than anything done by the financial sector itself.
And then that include damn.
Sorry?
No, I was just
Crazy.
Yeah,
It's a shame because it's sort of no one talks about the climate crisis so much anymore. It's kind of been put on the back burner.
Yeah, reason being that the side that disputes it and trivialises it has won.
Yeah,
They've won the political debate.
Yeah.
Most people, even people who still think that global warming is dangerous, have been sort of lulled into the expectations economists have pumped out about the scale of change. And frankly, that's not very big. I mean, there's a bunch of economists were surveyed, economists who'd written on climate change in the top 25 economics journals were surveyed back in 2020 in a paper by people here called Howard and Sylvan. And one of the questions they asked about what damages to GDP do you expect out of a trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming by 2200, so 2 centuries away, 7 degrees of warming. The median prediction from those economists was a 20% fall in GDP in 2200. The average is 25%. Now that translates into about a 0.1% fall in the rate of economic growth because you're talking 2 centuries away. say it's going to be 20% difference is a tiny difference in the rate of growth. So if you could actually imagine a planet where there was no global warming, so no fossil fuels and all the other fictional things you'd need for that, that would grow a tiny fraction faster than our economy where you're using fossil fuels, you're going to have global warming. The difference in growth rates is about 0.1%. Now, the question that they asked gave numbers out of Nordhaus's DICE program, where he estimated that in the absence of global warming, the global economy would grow by 1.5% per annum. Okay? So this bunch of economists said, 7 degrees of warming, 2 centuries hence, will go rather than 1.5, we'll go at 1.4. You couldn't tell the difference. Okay? Now, 7 degrees of warming, you speak to climate scientists, they say maybe lizards will survive.
Wow.
Okay? Because that level of warming that rapidly in terms of, geological scale of events has never occurred in the history of the planet except when the meteor hit that wiped out the dinosaurs. Right? To get that fast a change in temperature, you've got to that's the only comparable event. And 85% of species died at the time, and they think something of the same. Like if we go towards 7 degrees, okay, then I'll quote one of my favourite papers on this topic, published in a science journal, Suan Ramanathan, 2017, and they said, please keep below 2 degrees of warming. It was sort of pleading to say stay below 2. And there used to be a category of dangerous warming, and that dangerous warming was 1.5 degrees or more. That's where the Paris Accords came from. And they said, we're going to fine-tune this and say 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 degrees is catastrophic, and 5 degrees, anything more than 5 degrees, is beyond catastrophic, including existential risks. In other words, we probably won't exist as a civilization and maybe won't exist as a species.
Wow.
That's what we're playing with. So because everybody's accepted, without realising it, they see these statements in the paper saying 20% fall in GDP. And there's the most recent one by, I think it's Kolz, K-O-L-Z, and a couple of other authors published last year. They said there'd be a 19% fall in GDP in 2050, which is quite a large fall over that period of time. But to be a 19% fall in 2050 compared to what it would have been without the additional warming between now and 2050, that is something like about a 1% fall in the rate of economic growth. They're still talking positive economic growth. So everybody's accepting stuff which implies that global warming is not catastrophic. Talk to the scientists, it's catastrophic.
So where does that fall in GDP come from? Is it...
Oh, imagine you starve to death.
Yeah, well...
Okay.
But is it... Because, for example, here you mentioned something I hadn't thought about is the speculation over, for example, like real estate or insurance companies, like the fall of many markets that we're used to, right? If Florida is flooded, all of a sudden, the real estate is valueless.
You can't sell the houses if they're underwater. Yeah. So that's the slowest growing form of danger, rising sea level. Okay, and everybody, if you talk about it, people, it's going to take a few hundred years for Greenland to melt and West Antarctic.
And then they say we'll adapt,
etc. You can't adapt if, for example, there's a day of extreme temperatures over the Iowa wheat crop, say temperatures of 45, 50 degrees, low humidity, that can burn the entire crop in a day. Or you could have a flood come through. And the flood, like in Greece just recently, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a flood in the northern section that literally inundated, created a new lake where there used to be agricultural output. So suddenly there's no more food, no more wheat coming out of that part of Greece. You've got to import it from somebody else. All you need is 2 or 3 of those to happen at much the same time, and there is no somebody else to import from. So you could get to the point where there's not enough food for every person on the planet. Now, how do you decide who starves to death in that situation? No? But that's what we're playing with. And like there's a range of things which you have to read the science literature to realise what scientists are talking about as potential threats. But one of the most scary ones in terms of the credibility of the person who proposed it is that the guy who discovered the hole in the ozone layer, okay, we know we addressed that back with chlorofluorocarbons back in the 1980s and so on, found a different way to make freezing devices and got rid of that hole. He is the global expert on ozone and atmospheric chemistry. He's professor of atmospheric chemistry at Harvard. You don't get much more solid mainstream science credentials than that. Anderson's his last name. I can't think of his first name. But he argued that, and again, this is based on empirical research into what's happening with carbon dioxide levels and atmospheric dynamics in America. If you get, I think it's 500 parts per million carbon dioxide, we're already about 430. You get to 500 parts per million, that increases the temperature of the Gulf of America, okay? And means an increase in the moisture levels of storms that get to the western plains of America, meaning that you get superstorms that will penetrate not just the level we live, the troposphere, which is where we live, it's below 10 kilometres, but it gets into the stratosphere, which is 10 kilometres and up. And the troposphere which we live in has obviously got a lot of moisture, air content. There's water vapour everywhere. Okay, so and water vapour rises with rising temperature, but the stratosphere is very dry, and the stratosphere is also where the ozone layer occurs. It's a very, very large range of the stratosphere where there's a preponderance of O3 rather than O2, and then O3 happens to be a very effective means of preventing ultraviolet radiation getting down. So that was one reason we can go out during the day. We don't need, it's a suntan lotion for the planet in that sense. Well, he argued that when these storms start developing over the Midwest, they will reach into the stratosphere. So the storm will then take moisture from the troposphere into the stratosphere, and it will also take, and again, he's a professor of atmospheric chemistry. I'm an amateur on chemistry, but he says bromide and chlorine will both be brought into the troposphere. Then bromide and chlorine and water vapor together develop a catalytic process that destroys ozone. So he said once we hit 500 parts per million, it's quite likely the ozone layer will break down. Now, if the ozone layer breaks down, that's goodbye life on the planet, okay? We couldn't go outdoors during, say, daylight hours anymore. Okay? Agriculture will be, apparently plants have got quite a high level of protection against ultraviolet. Animals don't. So the animal population would start to fall. Humans couldn't go outdoors during daylight without putting on massive amounts of sunblock. If you get about 50, that's not going to be enough. Not that I know, but that sort of scale. So that's what we're playing with, those sorts of catastrophic changes. The big one for Europe, have you heard of what's called the AMOC?
No.
Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
No.
Okay.
I think you talked
about it in the first.
I talked about it the first time, I think, yeah. It's a huge system of ocean currents driven by both temperature differences and salinity differences, and it links all the oceans. It links the Antarctic to the Arctic as well. The amount of water fasting is about 50 times the volume of all the rivers on the planet. And as it happens, the part of the current that goes through the Atlantic comes up and curves around the coast of Europe where it's still warm, and then it cools and sinks and comes back down under. Now, the loop where it's floating on the surface is because it's highly saline. Again, I'm no expert on the chemistry, but it's highly saline, and that's part of the whole mechanism. Because we're melting so much ice water from Greenland and also from the Arctic, that is diluting that salt, which means that process may stop. And it has stopped in geological time in the past. Now, that would mean, on average, an average fall in the temperature of northern Europe of 10 degrees. And it's also would make winters much more extreme. So winters would be much colder, summers would be slightly warmer, but this dramatic increase in the range of temperatures that applied. So summers would be hotter than they are now, winters would be freezing. You could get extreme events, not common, but extreme events where London would hit minus 20 degrees Celsius. Now, if you have that applying over the whole continent, then parts of it are going to turn back into glaciers again.
Wow.
Now, could you have, if the AMOC breaks down, life in Europe is likely to be unsustainable.
Wow.
So that's what we're toying with. And like when you look at the original studies into this area, scientists had discovered the AMOC, that you use this as partly when you look at how the ships used to sail from Europe to America and back again, they found themselves using effectively these currents. They weren't even aware what they were. And then, of course, a bit of research, there's one current on the surface, which is the Gulf Stream, driven by the rotation of the Earth and wind effects out of that. Then there's this bottom one, which means you can have a current going up to Europe and sort of brushing the coast of Africa, and then coming down, brushing the coast of America. Ships used to use that as a way of getting, using less energy and less time to travel between the two. We never thought they'd break down. Then you get people analysing, it has broken down in the past, and now they're looking at what temperature will it take to break it down. It's all brand new research in the sense that it was never necessary to consider that 30 or 40 years ago. So when the first study was done by climate scientists about what temperature they thought would cause the AMOC to break down, the range was 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Okay. Now with more and more study, more and more mathematical models and so on, they're now thinking the range is somewhere between 1.2 and 3 degrees. Wow. Now, we're already at 1.5. Okay? So the possibility is there that the AMOC could break down. And then again, it was all new studies trying to work out if this is going to happen, how fast would it happen. The studies are saying that there could be a rate of decline of temperatures when the AMOC, in Europe, not globally. The globe would stay much the same average temperature because this just distributes heat around the globe. It isn't a net heat source. They say that it could be, the rate of change of temperature could be as fast as 3 degrees per decade. Now, 3 degrees per decade falling temperature with a terminal temperature 10 degrees below, the possibility that Europe could survive that, both its agricultural systems and its transport and everything else. Homes would be inadequate. You wouldn't have enough insulation during winter. Okay, that's places which are double glazed wouldn't be enough. You'd have more need for energy to keep them warm, and then that accelerates fossil fuel use and so on. It's chaos. You don't want to play with this shit. But economists have thought the whole damn thing is a cost-benefit exercise, and they've said we can play with this shit with no danger. And because most people don't realise how fucking hopeless garbage research has been done by these economists, they take the numbers seriously.
Who do you think is more to blame, the scientists or the economists? Who do you think are more to blame for the situation?
Economists.
But
Absolutely, there's no contest.
Is it unfair to solely blame the economist?
No.
But I feel like there's no appetite for just your in-depth analysis. People just want something that aligns with their worldview. I mean, if you ask most people about global warming, they don't care. It's boring. And now the narrative is that, well, especially in the UK, we pay the highest electricity costs in the world, I think.
Which is the privatisation more than bloody global warming, but anyway,
But people like Farage will push the view that, listen, we pay the highest cost because of Miliband's incessant net zero agenda. And that's where we're at. So I feel like politicians play a big part. The people, there's no real appetite for...
this is the same sort of thing as saying Xylon is good for your health. Okay? Why worry about going to a concentration camp? It is completely misunderstanding the physics of the system. And the planet couldn't give a shit what Farage thinks about global warming, okay? He's been fooled by economists and climate and fossil fuel companies to regard as something trivial you can ignore. It won't stop him being one of the people who could starve to death if it actually struck. So we've just completely trivialised one of the greatest dangers, the greatest danger we've ever faced. And but the trivialisation's been successful. And I've spoken to journalists who say, look, I can't get this past my editor. He reckons global warming is boring.
Honestly, no one cares anymore.
Yeah, well, they'll care shortly.
Yeah, I mean, we've got no choice.
It's like you'll care when you're thirsty, you'll care when you're hungry.
You'll care when you're starving to death.
Yeah. True. I mean, that's awfully depressing.
I know.
What makes you positive, if there is anything? That's a hard one.
Well, it's. I mean,
Are you
what
on the
makes me-
boat of Elon Musk to say, hey, we're going to move civilization?
Well,
toward
that's
doom?
one reason I wanted to get that bloody outpost on Mars, because the big. I mean, one thing I focus on is just how much we've learned in the last quarter millennium. The amount of knowledge we have about the universe. We take all this stuff for granted. We don't actually consider how much our understanding has changed over time. But if you go back 250 years, we didn't know that atoms existed. Okay? We didn't know that we knew other solar systems existed because we knew what stars were. We didn't think there were other galaxies. Okay? What was called the Magellan Cloud was thought to be a large lump of fuzzy stars somewhere in our galaxy, which is thought to be the entire universe. Now we know there's tens of thousands of millions or billions of galaxies. We have that knowledge. We know that matter consists of fundamental particles, atoms. We know they consist of quarks. I mean, the level of knowledge we've accumulated about the universe is incredible, and I love that, and I respect it, and I wish we could continue that future forward. And that's where I share the ambition that Musk has, that we have to become a multi-planetary species. And so that to me was so close, I mean, that's one reason I respect Musk on the whole emphasis. Somebody had to be the first person to attempt to build rockets which could potentially enable us to colonize other planets. He's the one for doing it. Top marks to him. Whether he did I don't care whether he's the engineer who did it. He set that goal and he used money he made to start developing that. So my feeling is that if we can get an outpost on Mars, then whatever we do to fuck up this planet, at least there's a alternative situation where humans exist. That's what made me potentially hopeful. But I've seen all the shit he's done with Trump. He's probably shot himself in the foot over getting that process of getting to Mars. And I've seen we've now had 3 consecutive failures of the Starship, which some people are now saying shows the design was never going to be effective in the first place. It's a possibility. But, the fact that we're so close is what makes me any sense of optimism I've got. And have you heard of what's called the Fermi paradox?
Fermi?
Fermi.
Never.
Okay, you know Enrico Fermi? You know the name?
Never.
Okay, look up Enrico Fermi. He's one of the guys who developed nuclear power.
Okay.
Now, he asked the question one day, where is everybody? In other words, if intelligent life is common, then why haven't we had aliens here yet? Why can't we find the signals? And another physicist developed what's called the Drake equation. You heard of that?
No.
Okay. It's a set of relationships. So how many solar systems have planets? Okay. How many planets of solar systems are in the Goldilocks zone? How many of those develop life? How many of those develop intelligent life? And you go through all the factors. And the argument made by many people is that there's what they call the great filter. There's something that happens. If you worked out the Drake equation and you got the answer that there had to be like potentially 100 intelligent civilizations in a galaxy over the galaxy's lifetime, then there could be an event that happens to all of them that means that intelligent life gets wiped out. And now I think potentially that's us for global warming, because if we actually the work done by one of the leading climate scientists who first raised the alarm about climate change, a guy called Jim Hansen. Jim's most recent work, and I'm going to use his first name because we do correspond. I'm in correspondence touch with him and quite a few other climate scientists.
He's a mate of yours.
Huh?
He said he's a mate of yours.
Yeah, I'd like to meet him. Haven't met him face to face, but like Tim Lenton, for example, is somebody I'd call a friend, and I wish I was working with him. We can't raise finance. Same thing you're talking about. We can't get funders to give us the money to do the research we want to do. So we're copying the climate change's boring effect from bloody so-called funders these days. But he worked out that on the trajectory he can see us going down, the terminal temperature rise we're going to get of global warming is 10 degrees. That won't happen straight away. It might take 2 or 3 centuries. But 10 degrees of warming is likely to mean that the only animals that are going to survive, apart from viruses and bacteria, are going to be lizards and your mammals may well be. And I'm extrapolating there, of course, but mammals could be virtually wiped out.
Wow.
Okay. Now that's what we're playing with. Is it boring?
No.
What's boring is people's ignorance.
Do you think social media has a part to play? Because I feel whilst there is so much knowledge out there, I mean, you read so many academic papers, clearly, people don't really do that anymore.
People are watching cat videos.
I mean, I love a good cat video.
So do I. Yeah. I get teary when I watch some of these things of one animal helping another animal out, and that's a good thing about humanity, a good thing about animals in general, the sense of empathy. So yeah, I'm not knocking it, but in terms of serious research and the level, the intellectual level of the species has plunged. And that's largely out of, I think, the marketization of education is a major reason why.
Yeah, and I also read that even the amount of people reading is completely just plummeted.
Attention span goes down. I mean, for example, when I did my master's thesis, I read everything Marx wrote on economics in chronological order from 1844 to 1894. When I stacked the books up on top of each other, out of curiosity, it was just below the height of a tennis court.
Wow.
Tennis net,
Wow.
okay, 3 foot of
That's
books.
insane.
That's what I read. That's what he also wrote, okay?
Wow.
And that's only economics. So we've also got all the political writing and stuff like that. So the extent to which people used to read in the 19th century far exceeds what we find commonplace now. Marx was a correspondent for the New York Times, and people would be desperately waiting for his next article. And his article would be 5,000 words. And so that intent and deep focus is something that was part of our culture until the post-war period. I think that's one reason why China is doing better. China's also into cat videos and all sorts of other fun videos. but in terms of focus upon high-quality education, that is an absolute priority of the Chinese culture because they've still got this foundation of Confucianism. We haven't got that. We've trivialized everything. If you can't sell it, it's not worth anything. And we've commodified education, and the level of learning that people are doing in the West is hopeless compared to what we need. And that's, again, why I think China's got a chance of pulling through this because they still have that historical Confucianism focus upon education and hard work to learn. And the West has trivialized everything.
It's completely gone now. And, when we do these podcasts and we talk to people like you, we are just amazed just at the depth of knowledge and how much you guys have read.
Yeah.
And then you think about people in the 18th century and the 19th century when these books were so hard to come by and, they don't have access to the amount of knowledge that we do today, but there's no demand for it. And I don't see it coming back. People just do not care. My younger brother absolutely hates reading because he just wants to be on TikTok all day. He doesn't even see the value of reading.
Well, no, I get quite up flicking through videos. We get videos on YouTube, and I'll flick through for a while. There's an endorphin hit.
The YouTube shorts, they get you.
Sorry?
The YouTube shorts, they get you.
They're insane.
They do, don't they? Yeah.
And they know exactly what you like.
Yeah.
And it's so...
it's all marketing. It's all about making money. It's not about making knowledge. And that's what we've lost. So that's why the Chinese system, because of its historical focus on Confucianism and respect for the teacher and the engineering focus of that culture as well, you can't be an engineer and flick through TikTok all day.
No.
Okay? To actually be able to do the mathematics involved and work out the finite element analysis and everything else, you've got to be seriously focused. And so a STEM attitude and an engineering attitude, which underlies Chinese culture again, makes you've got to continue reading. You can have pleasure, but you've got to have something. You've got to have pain as well. The Western approach, particularly American, is all about instant gratification.
It's so hard to sort of overcome this.
Could we take a 2-minute break? I just need a...
No, I'm sorry. I've got to keep on asking me questions. Okay?
Yeah. No, Steve, you honestly, you know so much.
It's crazy, mate, because I didn't... do you have any members of your family who went to university before?
Yeah, both of my parents did.
See, I didn't. I was the first member of my family to go there. And I was I think I was lucky at the time that I was raised, because born in 1953, it's less than 10 years after the Second World War. There was an incredible focus upon building a new culture and building a new society that wouldn't end up in the mistakes that led to World War II. So I was just part of that whole ethos. I'm lucky as well. I'm a speed reader. So like I did a speed reading course one day.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, it was quite funny. My mother found about it and dragged us all up to give it. Mum was a wonderful mother. So she said, this would be fun. Let's go along and find out what it's like. And the guy was going through explaining it. And Mum is skeptical. And he says, do you read music? And she said, yes. He said, well, you're reading the treble and the bass sections. That's about a 1.5 inch span. So you can read the whole lot at once. Why can't you read that much text at once? Mum goes, wow, yeah, okay. So I was, of course, listening. Yes, that's true. So then got us to they give you a novelette, a little book of short stories, and there'd be a device which ran a ruler down to make sure your eyes moved at a particular speed.
Wow.
So they'd first of all they'd get you to read, and then say, now we're going to get the machine on you. So I went along to the course, and they just said, now read through this book, and they said, okay, now turn to chapter 3. I've already read chapter 3. Oh, what about 4? Yeah, I've read 4. 5? Yeah, I read 5. 6, 7. I was the speed they wanted people to reach after the course, okay? Naturally, when I went in. And by the end of it, I was reading at 3,000 words a minute. So that, like I studied for the law exam in my final year, for commercial law too. I read the entire textbook in a day. And you absorb more as well. So I've got this capacity to read at high. I'm nowhere near as fast now. Probably read at about 500 words a minute.
Wow.
Which is
insane.
Faster than most people. It's slow compared to what I used to do. So I can absorb that information fairly rapidly. And I love reading. Yeah.
So if I were to start speed reading, how would you recommend me to?
Oh, there's speed reading courses you can find.
Just go. And
yeah.
find
So what they train you to do is to not read out the words, just read the words. You don't need to articulate them. So a lot of the slowing down is because you're actually articulating the words while you're reading. And then also you follow the whole text. What you have to do, which is really hard, is to expand your visual range. Like when I started, I did the final year law exams. In 1975, I think, and I hadn't been to university. I was involved in a student strike for the whole year, so I'd barely been I hadn't been to any lectures at all. I had to read all the lectures and all the notes, and I found my eyes would start to weep because of the speed of reading. I had to lie in a dark room and recover, but I could read at 3,000 words a minute for that time, so I could finish a 300,000 word book in 2 hours.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
I heard a technique where you don't read from end to end.
That's right. You've got to read down.
Yeah.
You just go straight down. It hurts a bit because you've got to expand your visual range, but it does work.
See, I guess there was more of a reason because, I mean, if you're scuppered for an exam, you just have to read those lecture slides. Say if you've left it extremely last minute, you're going to have to read those lecture slides. Nowadays, the kids just go to ChatGPT and
yeah, you can just download the PowerPoint, put it in ChatGPT, and say, "Hey, what's up?
tell me everything I need to know to pass this exam."
And this is dumbing,
But I'm worried though, and I think I have a mate Harry, and we talk about this, and we've actually tried to do assignments and not use ChatGPT.
Okay, yeah.
And we were just talking about our experiences doing this. And we found it so much more rewarding doing it that way. And
without ChatGPT. Yeah.
Without ChatGPT. And you find that it just makes you lazy. Like doing an essay without ChatGPT isn't that hard. But nowadays, people think that's just completely out of the question. We've become so accustomed to this way of approaching essays. We're scared of hard work or doing things which don't have that instant gratification. And it's quite worrying because, all right, we grew up in a time where we saw ChatGPT coming. Imagine the kids 18 years from now.
They're born in it, yeah.
Who are immersed in this world of ChatGPT. Like, surely it's going to infantilize us in a way, in our mental capacities.
I think it has happened, yeah. And that's... there's something about rote learning. I saw so much modern education was about, don't do rote learning, let's teach them how to learn something, which is, there's some truth to that. But like, if you learn the 12 times table, you're actually rewiring your brain to actually have these things wired into your head. I remember once I did school debating, and the debating had marks for manner, matter, and method, and then teamwork. So I think it was 40, 40, 20, and then 10 for each person. And so you had 6 people on a team. You had 6 times 3, so that's 18 numbers that way. And then you had the other one, so 24 numbers, which are done in a grid of 6 by 4 on a table. And my dad was he was the bloke who brought in the decimal currency system in Australia.
Oh, wow.
And he brought in the second auto teller in the country. He was really pissed off he wasn't the first. It wasn't his fault. Management told him to adapt an American system rather than developing his own, which he knew was faster. And he wrote the accounting system for the bank, Commonwealth Bank. So, bloody bright bugger all around. But Dad was sitting and he just heard this person reading out the numbers and said, I think she got the sums wrong. And I stood next to him seeing him do this. He just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, and he corrected all the numbers. So his arithmetic skill was off the scale. He could look at numbers and add them up and just write them all out correctly. Wow. And that was because he spent all his time doing manual accounts. Because back then there were no computers when he began. He began working at the bank, the Commonwealth Bank, in 1950 or 51, well before computers were commonplace. So everything was done manually. You'd write stuff down. You'd add up numbers. You didn't have a calculator to help you. So what that meant was the arithmetic skill was off the scale. Well, I'm hopeless arithmetically. Okay, I can add up numbers ultimately, but I just go and use a calculator, or I use a mathematics program, or that sort of thing. So that particular skill's been denigrated to me. I think it's a useful skill. I think kids should learn how to add up and shouldn't be able to use a calculator. They should learn what sums mean and so on. So that's a reasonable. There are some skills you have to learn by practice, and so if you take those away with things like ChatGPT and so on, then you dumb down a huge part of the population. You still have to have people of hyper intelligence designing this stuff in the first place, but the average member of the population becomes dumb. When you're dumb, you're easily manipulated. True. And that's what we're seeing now.
I think that's a good point you mentioned, because the argument is like, okay, for arithmetics, a generation of ours would say, all right, well, why do we need it? We have the calculator, we have this. Same, and that can go on for anything. It's like, why do we need it? Now AI can do it.
Yeah.
But
why do you need a brain?
Yeah, exactly, right? The AI can just do everything. But I think that point is to say that, hey, you can get manipulated. This, dictatorship can come easily controlled.
And we're seeing it now. I mean, Carl Sagan made comments like this about a future which is dumbed down and people spend more time working out their horoscopes than anything else. And he's right.
But then didn't people also have that fear when the calculator first came out? They said that, maths is over, people just won't be able to do arithmetics anymore. And obviously people still were.
Yeah.
And people also apply that argument to AI and ChatGPT. They say, people have always said this about technology, but we still plow through. Human ingenuity will always remain intact. But for me, witnessing ChatGPT, and this is just at the start, I'm just very skeptical. I just think this will completely obliterate our abilities to think.
Yeah, I mean, we need to constrain those things. You can have the added benefit, but you've got to teach the rote skill as well. And that, again, is where China probably has an advantage, because the Confucian attitude is learning is good for you in its own sake. Learning how to do things is a necessary part of being a fully functioning human being. So you might not get instant gratification out of doing a times table, but I'm going to make you do it. This is what the dragon mum type of, you would have seen that comment as well about Chinese mothers forcing their kids to learn and so on. That's necessary. You actually need to have, it can't just all be about gratification. But that's the sort of society we've descended into in the West.
Are you in that camp of people that believes the West is in civilizational decline, or whatever you want to call it?
I mean, America in particular. And like this, again, I blame economists for it, because all the garbage they produce, it looks like it's wisdom to people who haven't dived into the foundations, ends up being focusing on this whole idea of short-term gratification. The level of ignorance we have about the economy has permeated to everything else. And we let economists tell us what happened with climate change. They haven't got a bloody clue what climate change is. Having read literally all of the papers that economists have written on the cost of carbon, what they call the total cost of carbon, and I've written about 600 papers, I would reckon. Not one of them is worth reading. Not one of them should have been published. Now, what that would mean, because they get the status of being a science out of the reputation of economics, a huge part of the damage they've done is this short-term utility maximising, cost minimising. It's all a short-term focus. It's not a focus upon investment, development, etc., etc. And that's a huge part of what's justified this short-term attitude. You look at the Confucian logic that China still has as its core, that still says you should learn for its own sake. I don't care if you're not going to enjoy this. Okay, you're going to do it. And that the paternal attitude, that we call that paternalism. Okay, it's often frankly maternalism. I've known enough Chinese dragon mums. But what it means is you have a focus on developing your own skills. And that's what we have lost that. It's all about what gratifies me now, not what skills can I build. So we that's why I think China is still a strong culture. America's been weakened. And, you know, its racial problems, its the profit maximizing, not looking for elevating the social value of people. I don't see America. If you have to think about countries to be in when global warming hits, America's probably the second last place I'd be.
Where's the first?
Have a guess.
Oh, let's think.
London. You guys live there.
London.
Why?
Or the UK. Yeah.
Nah, I'm thinking London is an island. They're gonna run out of food. They're a mess.
Yeah, well, 40% of the UK's food is imported. So when a food crisis strikes, and I don't mean if, I mean when.
Oh no! So you mean London is the worst place?
The worst place.
Oh yeah, we were asking what's the best place.
Where's the best place?
Yeah.
No, but I think that's more interesting.
But yeah, all right, yeah. Actually, tell us why London is worse first.
Well, because for a start, you import 40% of your food. It's food. You know? When a famine strikes, then the UK is one of the countries which will not be able to, can't support its own population on its own merits, and won't be able to import either. So at that point, I think global warming will get interesting.
But don't many people say that the global south would be more dramatically impacted by
global south? If you're living in a third world country, you're much closer to the rural than you are in the Western country.
Very true.
And you are likely to have some rural skills as well, relatively speaking. So I think third world countries, they're going to be more hit by the temperature changes, and certainly they can be hit by drought and effects like that with changes in climatic patterns. But in terms of the skills of a person, like I've got friends in Uganda, for example, and they are teaching people how to farm. So if anything goes wrong, it's a much more rural society than we are. There's more chance to survive just because you have the rural. I think the biggest ones to suffer are going to be urban people in the northern hemisphere.
That's very interesting. And I used to have this conversation with an old mate of mine.
Oh, yeah.
Because he said, listen, us in the cities, we don't actually have real skills. And he made a comparison. Have you seen that video of there's these tribesmen? They're in Africa somewhere.
Yeah.
And they walk together to sort of steal food from a lion and its family.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen that when they all march together? And they've developed these ways of taking food from a lion just from years.
From lions.
Yeah, from lions. So a lion has a lion, and they've killed a zebra and they're eating it. Apparently, if you get 20, 30, a tribe of us, we all march towards the lion and we're confident.
The lion will back off.
The lions are terrified because they're like, what is this?
They've had 300,000 years of experience us as hunters.
But that, exactly, and that's true. Well, I'm not saying our knowledge here isn't true, but that's like they have this relationship with the animals, with
land,
nature, with plants, and you can't take that away. With us, all of our knowledge is based around being in a city. Like civilizations do collapse, and once they collapse, what do you know? How do you get food?
Nothing.
How do you get water?
I know nothing. I mean,
shelter?
I know I'm useless for that. I've got a couple of friends. One guy I'm thinking of particular lives in Tasmania in Australia. He was an American guy. He was country bloke. He went hunting. He'd go hunting and get venison and stuff like that. Now he hunts in Tasmania. He's taught his daughters how to hunt. So his attitude is, my kids have got the skills to survive when things go completely awry. Whereas the vast majority of people in the West don't have those hunting skills, and even Americans with all their guns, they're good at shooting at each other. Don't know how good they're going to be shooting at a cougar and stuff like that. And so the capacity to interact with the land is greater in third world countries than it is in the West. So I think the West is going to be the one that gets the wake-up call.
So where would be the best place to be?
Well, in terms of developed societies, I'd go for China. China is not food self-sufficient, but one big project that's involved right now is trying to convert a massive area of desert into agricultural land, which involves a huge amount, giant infrastructure projects to get water from other parts of China to that area of land. If they can do it, they'll double their arable land.
I think they're doing also a lot of weather transformation or doing things with the weather to see how they can.
Well, I think we have the weather modification. That's getting caught up in conspiracy theories, so I won't go too far there.
Oh, really? That's not real.
Huh?
I saw somewhere that China was working on that. That even at universities they are offering such courses to learn how to weather modifications. But is that not?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole without looking at some research on it. But like what they are doing is trying to make themselves more resilient as a society. It's like China's carbon dioxide, China's coal consumption is falling now because they've finally built enough solar and other. They've got the world's first functional thorium molten salt reactor. So once they've cracked that, they'll be pumping them out they'll have a factory making them, or factories making them. So they've got a better potential to break away from fossil fuels than any other country on the planet. They make 90% of the world's solar panels are made in China. Whether they're sustainable in the long term, and I've got colleagues who argue that we don't have enough minerals to maintain them, but that's a debate I'm not going to get into. But in terms of having alternative energy systems, building up local food resilience, and having the skill level to survive as a culture on its own, I think China is probably the most sustainable society on the planet.
What about given their population? They have a massive population to sustain.
1.4 billion. That's part of the issue. I mean, it's gigantic. And the land area is reasonably big as well. It's not the most densely populated place on the planet, but it is huge. So, they've got enormous issues about holding it all together. But again, because they have this culture that emphasizes collective, that it went too far with Mao, obviously. But there's an element to which the Chinese people know that the reason they've been successful is because they are Chinese people. Okay? It's not just individual Chinese. Americans think, I did this, therefore I'm a genius, and I did it all on my own and nobody else helped me, yada, yada, yada. No Chinese person is quite that stupid. So there's more of a recognition of the reliance upon a culture that America gives, but also they're run by engineers. So all the projects they're putting together, the debates they have over which engineering projects to undertake and how to do them, not whether you should do it market-based or government. We're caught up in crazy ideological fights. We call that politics. The Chinese are much more in so what do we wish to achieve? How do we achieve it? Those sorts of debates occur, but they actually build the infrastructure. So in terms of having the infrastructure to hold a giant society like that together, that's one reason they built those high-speed rail, which is the whole. I mean, there was only a handful of them when I was last in China, and it was 2016, I think. Haven't been back. They've built most of that. I want to go there and just experience the railways, let alone the rest of it. So in terms of a society which can hold together, I think I'd give China a chance. More Asian countries than European. the Netherlands is not a bad country on that front. You know that Netherlands is the world's second largest food exporter.
They have those greenhouses, which they
a massive greenhouse-based food production, which uses carbon dioxide. There's all sorts of elements to it that are problematic. They rely upon fossil fuels to do that. So there are question marks. But if any society has got a huge buffer of food producing capability to survive what might go wrong, the Netherlands has it. The UK, anything but. So like China, if I had to say the part of human civilization that I'm pretty much sure will survive, and again, I could be making a wrong extrapolation here, but it's Papua New Guinea.
Why?
Because in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, there's over 200 valleys. They're highlands, so they're high altitude. They're not copying the incredible increase in temperature at the sea level. Everybody, not everybody, but people it's hunting and gathering society with a whole range of other elements these days. But they're, again, the same thing you were saying about Africans and being able to confront a lion, you don't need to worry about it in Papua New Guinea. But being capable of providing your own food and being able to survive without any other group, I think the Papua New Guinea Highlanders have got an advantage. And then maybe New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand is so isolated, but all the billionaires are trying to build bunkers down there right now. Australia, moderately so, but Australia is, again, it's got the worst elements of America in terms of its lack of interest in developing its own productive resources. It's got too many neoclassical economists. So for example, it doesn't produce cars anymore. Okay? It doesn't have a tooling industry. So if you do have a breakdown in exports from other parts of the world, then Australia just lacks the productive capability to do anything about it. New Zealand, which is a population of about 5 million, ranks higher on what's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which gives you the range of products that country can produce, ranks higher than Australia with 6 times the population. So New Zealand maybe, but yeah, it's you've got to have both this cohesiveness to society so it won't fall apart at the first level of pressure. That writes America off. And you've got to have food capabilities, which makes China probably, given what they're doing, probably viable. But yeah, to me, I have a serious doubt that civilization will make it to 2050.
Wow. But then with China, do you think that can sustain itself, this authoritarian rule? Because isn't that the argument as to why democracy is superior? It's because...
How authoritarian is it?
That's what I'm actually, I'm trying to work out. And there seems to be some level of compliance as well.
There was absolute authoritarianism under Mao. And like I experienced that when I went there in 81, 82. And Maoism was over. Deng Xiaoping had taken over. But people still had to protect their asses all the time. So any question you asked, the first answer was, I followed the directives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. I'm not joking. That happened at every bloody question we asked in public forums. So you're protecting your ass. You can't be criticised if you've done exactly what you were told to do. So that element was there. But that was all because the craziness of the political and economic system under Mao. So there was still very much a rural society, agrarian society, and most of the fights at the Politburo level were over people who were in favour of grain production versus those in favour of protein, legumes versus grain. And they would to and fro over those issues and never developed decent industrialisation. It was a mess. Under Deng Xiaoping, because they've had this focus upon raising the level of the country, it's been so successful that people expect a huge increase in their per capita income, living standards, on a decade level basis, and they're getting it. And then to get into the Communist Party, which is huge. And I think the Communist Party has 50 million members.
Yes, I think it's I don't know the facts.
Yeah, but it ends up being a sort of not a good form, not the best form, but a perverted form of what the Athenians had, because we all think about Athenian democracy. Most Athenian democracy was not based on elections, but based on what they call sortition. So with sortition, it was a random number generator. Okay? You'd ask, many positions were filled by a process of saying who do you think should fill the position to leading people in society. Now, if you ask Donald Trump who should fill a position, he's going to nominate his daughter. Okay, but it was once you nominated the next level was then asked, and the level after that, and the level after that. So there were several stages, which meant that nobody thought they could actually influence what the final decision was. So you'd select somebody you thought was intelligent and capable, and then they would suggest somebody else they thought was intelligent and capable, and so on. So you got a level of disinterest, self-disinterest in the people who are selected for leading positions in the society. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, you've got to suck up to the person above you to some extent. You've got to conform to the ideology, but the ideology has been far more flexible than Western ideology has been. You've got to have training in STEM, largely speaking. Most of the people in the Communist Party, like Z apparently was a chemical engineer. Okay? So there's something about it that means you select people of high skill and high intelligence. Now that kills what we're doing in the West. So in that sense, it's authoritarian in the sense you don't have two sides of politics having ideological slanging matches. You don't have Farage on one side and Jeremy Corbyn on the other. You've got a bunch of engineers saying, how do we build this program? What's going to develop our country more effectively? What threats do we face, do we think, in the future? How can we work on them? And that gives you an engineering, get things done attitude. And the consequence for the average person is they're let free to do what they want within the level of economic activity the country is currently capable of. And yeah, it's like I saw the figures on this just recently and it blew me away. The rate of per capita income growth in America from 1960 to now is about 1.7% per annum, which is not bad because it's skewed massively towards the wealthy. The wealthy got most of that per capita increase. But that means over a period of 40 years, roughly, you'll double your per capita income. China's rate of growth is 9% per annum, which means in a decade, you'll more than double per capita income. Now, that means you can actually see the improvement in your own lifetime. So somebody, and I've got my ex-girlfriend from China, she's in her late 50s, I think now. She was born during the Mao days, and one way she got herself a bit of status was by harvesting a lot of grass for some animals and got a reward for it. She actually stacked the box full of stones to make it look like it weighed more. Okay, that sort of shit. Okay.
The old trick.
Okay, that sort of trick. But like in her lifetime, so she's say 50 or 60, roughly. I'm doing guessing now, but she had seen her standard of living has risen by 2 to the power of 6, 32 times better off, in effect, than she was when she was a child. So that level of improvement in your well-being means that people in China, generally speaking, think they're lucky to be Chinese. Okay? Now, how many Americans feel they're lucky to be American? They get brainwashed about it. Okay? But if anything, the bottom half of American society has seen their status and their incomes decline over time. So that means that China, I think, is more, even though it doesn't have what we call democracy, so it doesn't have a contest between narcissists with opposing ideologies every 4 years.
So what's the way back for the West? Because I guess the idea of having the most intelligent, capable people ruling goes back to ancient Greece. But then we look at today and there seems to be this disdain for technocratic leaders. I mean, Mark Carney, he's now the leader of Canada, but people instantly were berating him because I personally think is because he's a technocrat. And,
he's a neoclassical economist. Again, it's economists who fucked us up.
But I also think there's a more demand for a Trump, a Farage, someone who might not be as let's say intelligent, but they speak to the people, they connect, they can communicate extremely well.
Yeah.
Or Macron in France, someone who's extremely a technocratic, intelligent bloke. But again, he doesn't connect anymore. People just want these, for lack of a better term, these populist leaders who can connect, deliver a message. You know, so how do we go back to...
But look, the technocrats you're talking about are all technocrats with degrees in economics.
So engineers...
Technocrats in Asia are degrees with engineering. Okay? It's
Because even Macron is
Sorry?
even Macron was an economist. Is this guy in Canada as well?
Yeah. So again, I blame economics for a huge part of the pathetic state of human civilization, and as China was lucky to be insulated from it for the last 60 years.
Do you feel like economists need to be humbled? Because I feel like maybe engineers, they work in this very, realistic world. And I feel like economists today, now the whole world is, surrounded by the economy. How do we know the world is doing good? The economy is doing good.
Exactly.
Who do we listen to? The economists.
Yeah.
So they've been put on this pedestal. Like we were talking about how economists is a science, but now they're even above. Who cares about math, right? Look at these economists. They'll tell you if we're making money, if we're happy. So they're pretty much on this pedestal.
And I think that's a huge part of our problem.
But part of it is like, when are they going to get humbled? I mean, the global financial crisis didn't humble them.
Well, this is the trouble. They're going to be humbled by the collapse of capitalism. The next book, I was supposed to finish it in March, and I wrote that book for Musk and also one to attack Reeves, which I haven't finished. And then now I think I should have maybe just written the book I planned to write. But I've got a book with Polity Press, the working title for which will probably be the final title, and it's How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism. Because since they've convinced us that global warming is trivial, is boring, okay, it's going to hit us well before we're ready for it. And when it hits in terms of damaging our productive resources, our capability to respond to what it does to us will be diminished as well. And then in that whole process, I expect capitalism to collapse. And in that situation, then we'll realise, who are we listening to about it? Weren't they supposed to be experts on capitalism? They're so full of garbage. I mean, they're models of production, they're models of banking, they're all a whole series of myths. And they're as convincing as Ptolemaic astronomy was to Ptolemaic astronomers. Okay? But they're about as realistic about the economic universe as Ptolemy was about the solar system. So I think that's a huge part of our problems.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, Musk is successful, we're able to continue civilization in Mars. How would that lead to a successful civilization if we just take the same models that we have on Earth?
You can't have the same model.
So how would you change things?
Well, for a start, I mean, I don't expect a civilization on Mars. If there's one city that can survive, then that'll do me if it can survive. But you might need about 1 million people to have a functional system up there. But in that world, you simply cannot be non-technological. Okay? There's no way that you can ignore technology. There's no way you can trash your living quarters. Like, living quarters on Mars are going to be enclosed, recirculated oxygen, food systems. You can't have them being depleted, and you can't have huge inequality in those systems because the inequality itself will take enormous amounts of energy to sustain, more than the system can actually enable. So Musk was I don't know who's still got involved in this, but he had an Italian research team talking about what would be the structure of a civilization, a city civilization on Mars. And one point they realized was you can only have large spaces if they're public, because the energy and the containment costs are enormous. And you could not have the level of wealth inequality that we have in the West. You'd obviously, if Musk makes it to Mars, then he's going to be treated
He'll be the top dog.
He'll be the top dog. But by that time, he's already in his 50s. God knows when we'll actually get there. But you won't have the same level. You won't have the huge inequalities that exist here. You'll you'll have to have an emphasis upon technological change, and the emphasis would be on, can we actually make Mars a habitable planet? I've seen all sorts of maybe crazy ideas, but huge extreme ideas, things about like putting a whole bunch of satellites in orbit that can regenerate a magnetic field, that create a magnetic field for Mars. Ultimately, there's a whole range of books on terraforming Mars, which you may have seen, fictional books. There are now people working out how could you actually terraform. I think that is unlikely. That is such a huge task that I'm not banking on that. I just want to have an outpost that survives, so that the damage that occurs on Earth, we can still have a human developed civilization surviving elsewhere. Because if we have the sort of warming that Jim Hansen is talking about, 10 degrees warming, then that means a 70, like in terms of just the simple stuff, ocean level rises 70 metres. So all our major cities are underwater. Food production becomes impossible across most of the planet. The worst extreme that could happen in terms of a change of the climate is a breakdown of the circulation cells. So you know that we have the circulation called the Hadley cell, which is air rises at 0 degrees and falls at 30. And then there's, in the polar, there's air falling at 90 and rising at 60. And in between there's what's called the ferrocell that's motivated by the other two. That's why we have a tropical, a temperate, and a frozen range in each hemisphere. If you have a large enough increase in temperature, and it takes a huge amount of energy to do that, those three cells break down into one. That's called the equable Earth scenario. That's why we had alligators at various times in history in the polar regions, because there was only one circulation cell, so the temperature over the entire hemisphere was much more uniform. Now, what that means is, apparently, there's massive rainfall at the equator, there's massive rainfall at the pole, there's not much in between unless it's catastrophic rainfall levels, because for each 1 degree increase in temperature, the amount of moisture the air can contain increases by 7%. So if you have 1.07 to the power of 10, that's going to be something close to doubling the moisture content of the atmosphere. That also dries out the land, because it's like a sponge, it can absorb from the land. You get much more barren landscapes. The only survivable parts of the planet would probably be the poles. The only human civilization, would be up the North and South Pole. I mean, what the fuck's going to survive that? So the potential, if that happens, we move the temperature of the planet outside the range that we have evolved in, and also potentially outside the range that most mammals have evolved in. So what's going to survive? God knows. So if that goes on like for 10,000 years, that's quite a feasible length of time, maybe 20,000 years, then you would have Earth being uninhabitable until all that factor washed through. Then the next crazy stage is, have you heard of what's called Milankovitch cycles? Okay. They are named after a Russian mathematician. There's cycles in the temperature of the planet driven by variations in the orbit of the planet around the sun. So the orbit can be circular or elliptical, and it varies over time which one it is. There's a tilt of the planet, and it wobbles a bit, and then it precesses as well. So there's three mathematical motions. Generates a highly nonlinear complex system. But and it's only become important in the last 1.5 million years, because a gradual fall in temperature in the Earth. The Earth was up to 10 degrees warmer in the days of the dinosaurs and earlier. So it's fallen down. When the Milankovitch cycles have become dominant, what it's given us is a roughly 100,000 year cycle, where you have roughly 20,000 years of warm and 80,000 years of cold. So it's a period of going from glacials to interglacials and back again. And the glacials are about 6 degrees colder than we experienced before industrialization. And we industrialized on a peak of a hill. And the odds were that we would, like roughly speaking, we came out of this 12,000 years ago. We would normally have had another 8,000 years with a stable temperature. But as it happens on the Milankovitch cycles, the orbit of the Earth around the Sun now is almost perfectly circular. And that means that rather than this particular hot period lasting 20,000 years from beginning to end, it'll last 40,000 years. So we now have a period of time where the background temperature of the planet will stay about 6 degrees warmer than the previous glaciation. Now we're driving at 10 degrees warmer. Okay? So when that comes down, we might well find that we'll get to the point where the carbon dioxide slowly gets reabsorbed by the natural carbon cycle, and carbon levels in the atmosphere might fall from horrific levels. I mean, there's some arguments we could see 2,000 parts per million being feasible because global warming ourselves, we've gone from 280 parts per million to 430. If we trigger the release of all the carbon stored in the permafrost, which would happen with that level of temperature rise, that will double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That will also mean we acidify the ocean, so the oceans might no longer support life. This is horrific stuff we're talking about, potential stuff. So when that cycle, when the carbon pulse we've injected and we've triggered in other elements finally dissipates, it could be 60,000 years in the future, and then the temperature will be back into the glacial period again. So you'd go from you'd sort of high rise, and you'd then fall from like 10 degrees warmer than we are now to 6 degrees cooler. So imagine watching all that happening from Mars, and you basically know that life on that planet is be very lucky to survive of any form of life at all. So we then hopefully repopulate it after 40 to 60,000 years.
But I think despite everything that's going on now, we're talking about economic collapse, we're talking about the end of the world with climate change. I think we're still living in exciting times. Like I was speaking with Dara.
I like it less exciting. Thanks very much.
It's still like I'm happy to be living in this generation. There's all this stuff going on. AI innovation. We're talking about going to Mars. There's all this change. So I guess and maybe we can maybe end it on a positive note.
I hope we make it. I mean, I don't want to be. I don't want to be one of the last living generation of humans. I hope that the things I throw my work in a garbage bin, effectively. I hope we make it through. I really want to see it. But we're going to do it despite our leaders and despite our economists, not because of them.
Do you have advice for our generation going into this? Maybe some life advice, like how to not be so, I don't know, like how do we advance into this potential doomed future? And also, I guess some more personal advice for us. You've been booming on YouTube. Like how can we,
Well, I've got to thank Jordan, the marketing team behind my online course, for that happening. They've reworked everything, and that's why I've had a higher success rate there. A large part of, they say, it comes down to because YouTube is an advertising channel. Okay? The content on YouTube is there to get you to watch the ads. Okay? So if you can get people to watch your show for longer, if they get to the 11-minute mark, they watch 3 ads, and YouTube will therefore promote you.
And they're getting so smart with the ads, like watching, because we've come up with YouTube, and every year I see how it's evolving with the ads. Slowly. Now that they have like the skip, they don't tell you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The yellow, they're just becoming very smart with the ads.
Yeah, and I paid premium to avoid that shit.
Okay, well, I just get an ad blocker.
On premium, can you also download videos and watch it offline?
I haven't actually tried that. Apparently I can, yeah.
But fun fact, so Google owns YouTube. I used to always use like ad blocker on Google Chrome.
Oh yeah.
And recently Google blocked all ad blockers on Google Chrome to block ads on YouTube.
We're stuck. Yeah. So anyway, try to make your viewership to hang on longer.
Yeah.
That's the hard part. Maybe put out some shorts.
Yeah.
Do you do shorts from interviews?
So we do, but it's like not shorts, and they're not edited. We just cut. It's like 3 minutes, so that's not that short.
Yeah.
But
that's something which could help. Yeah. Like life skills, learn how to hunt. But also, start respecting education. This is the thing. Like the way in which education's been denigrated, I've seen it in my own life story, because I started like university when I first went there, like at the age of 17. The whole focus is on learning. That was what you went to university for. Now it's to get a career, to get a job. It's to become the whole focus on education as a life skill is gone. It's now about education's only worthwhile if it gets me a job. Well, fuck that for a joke. You've got to have education for the sake of learning. And that's why, again, I think the Chinese system is ahead of us. So check out Confucian ideas, start learning skills. Now, you guys have learned your sound skills pretty well.
Well, hopefully. I mean,
Well, mostly you.
one of our last podcasts, the mics are shut off. So we're still learning, I guess.
Yeah.
The learning never stops.
But enjoy learning. That's the thing. I mean, I would like to see universities back to the stage where they were free, but bloody hard to get into.
So what would you change
In the universities?
Yeah.
Oh, for a start, no more fees. Abolish fees. They paid for by the state. The whole idea that you have to pay fees argues that education is a private good and that it's best paid for privately. Make it public, free, but bloody hard to get into. Have education at different skill levels. We need people who are technicians. We need tradesmen. Don't think everybody's got to go to university. We need technical colleges that they used to exist. All this stuff about university education has been a hierarchical thing. A university is better than TAFE and bullshit. You need those people. Need to have those skill levels, but make it hard to get into, but free. Okay, so you got to work hard to pass. You can't use ChatGPT, all that sort of stuff. You've got to learn, pass difficult exams. You can be failed, which I was shocked by at Kingston. We get a call pulled over the coals if we gave less than 92% first class passes in third year, which is just nonsense. It's all about credentialism. Get away from that. So make education free but difficult.
I kind of wanted to ask you one last thing. So some people say that universities started to deteriorate when they expanded and created all these new degrees, like gender studies and whatnot. Do you agree? Do you think it has a place, or?
Oh, there's a lot of waffle in universities. So, like I have a fairly traditionalist approach. I'd like to have philosophy taught. I'd like to completely change economics, obviously. I'd like to see people studying history and all the classical subjects. Some of the stuff that's been created, like, for example, university education became essential to become a nurse. I've been married to a nurse. I've had nurses in my family. I've worked as a hospital orderly at one stage. The skills that you learn there are skills that are best learned on the job, not at a university education. So we've tried to push everything up in status, but if you raise everything up in status, nothing has status. So I'd rather go back to a more graduated education system like we used to have, not the 7-11, what's the 11 plus exam you have to do in England? That's a disaster. They're channeling kids that early.
Okay.
But definitely having respect for technical education, bringing back high quality, creating. The Germans still have a pretty high quality technical education system. Education is normally free in European countries, but it's harder to get in. We need to go back to those days. The state should fund education. But the individual to get in has to get a good mark.
Okay. Well, Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak to you.
To run it back in Amsterdam, what a pleasure.
Yeah, honestly.
So thank you so much.
You blow our minds every time.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's we're going to enjoy Amsterdam now. So what are your plans for the evening?
We have no plan. Maybe if you're going back into
The city,
the city, we can come with you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.